Last week I had mentioned about perhaps taking a bit of a break within our study of the book of Galatians, not to move on to a topic that is completely unrelated to what that we've been talking about, but since we're talking about the gospel message, what people need to be saved, what they must believe, talking last week about repentance, faith, belief, I think it's important that we help people with certain things in their life that they're struggling with before we even get to that, what is called pre-evangelism. For many people, we can't ask them to merely believe in God if they don't believe that God exists. The Bible makes it very clear that we need to give an answer to those who ask for the hope that we have. And we can't be afraid to answer questions that people have. That's part of the evangelistic process. We live in a world today where you mention the word God, and there's a whole panoramic spectrum of views on what that word even means. All kinds of different things come into people's minds when they hear the word God. And for more and more people, unfortunately, in our culture, the word God is to be equated with nonsense. People just don't believe in God anymore, and it's because of the atheistic intellectual culture in which we live. If you are unaware, and I hope you're not, our whole academic intellectual school system is biased and agenda-driven. Okay? That shouldn't be news to you. And it is at bottom line atheistic and naturalistic. There is no room for God in our school system at both the primary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. And so your children, your grandchildren are being raised in an environment which is like an incubator where these views and ideas are not only first given, but they are developed within that. And if we don't have counter arguments, then we're in big trouble. Maybe not personally, but for that task of evangelism and discipleship, there's a huge problem. One of the things that's noted about the present generation, okay, they have fine distinctions between age groups now, this generation, this generation, this generation. But if you think of school-age children and young people right now, one of the things they're finding is that when they get into their teenage years, kids are actually looking for answers. And that's new. In previous generations, they knew everything. They weren't looking for answers, at least they thought they knew everything. But now kids are actually inquiring. They want to know. But they don't want superficial, pat answers. They want real answers. Because people with certain letters behind their names are seen as authority figures, and when they hear them make certain declarative statements, there is no God, science has explained everything, and so forth and so on, they believe them because of what's behind it. And so we have to give them authoritative answers. When we come to the question of does God exist, many Christians would answer the question this way. If I were to go up to somebody and ask, do you believe in God? They would say, yes, I believe in God. If I say, why do you believe in God? They would say, I believe in God because the Bible says so. And I would say, why do you believe that? And they would say, because the Bible is inspired by God, giving an exact circular argument. I believe in God because the Bible says so. I believe in the Bible because God says so. So we go from God to the Bible to God, and we just go in this vicious circle. We're not proving anything. We're assuming our conclusions. Now, I believe in God because the Bible says so. And yes, I do believe that the Bible is the Word of God because it is inspired by God. But I believe it because there are facts and evidence behind those claims. I think there are sufficient reasons to believe in God for every rational person. Furthermore, I believe that the Bible itself testifies to the fact that it is the inerrant, inspired Word of God. So you can go down that road, but don't do it in a circular fashion. You're going to have to prove your point, your claims. But when it comes to the question, does God exist? There are good reasons that people should believe that. Now, we're dealing on the level of probability here because we can't deal in terms of mathematical proof. That's impossible. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims his handiwork." This is simply declaring that creation speaks of and bears witness to its creator. That's what it says. It screams out that someone made me. More specifically, in the scripture reading today, in Romans 1:19 through 20, it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them." Now circle those words. It's plain to them. Why? Because God has made it plain to them. See, God has written on the fabric of creation and on the human heart his existence. He's made it plain. In fact, he says so that they are without excuse. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Here, according to the Apostle Paul, God has made evidence of his existence plain in creation. It points not only to his existence, but to the fact that people ought to honor him and give thanks for his goodness. Okay, it says that they should glorify him, honor him, and it says that they should give thanks. Why? Because of his bountiful provision, that he is good. These two passages, and there are others in the Bible, tell us that God is not hiding. He has made his existence clear and identifiable in what he has made. So somebody should be able to look at creation and come to the rational conclusion that it didn't just get that way, come into existence, etc., by itself, but that God created it. Using this theological principle, namely that God has revealed his existence and invisible attributes in creation, the apologists, that is, we who are trying to give an account for what we believe, a defense, that's what the word apology means in its biblical roots, okay? The Greek word that we get the word apology actually means a defense. It doesn't mean to apologize for something. It means to give an intellectual defense for a belief, an answer for the hope that we have, according to Peter. So the apologist, that is us, is warranted in looking at the evidence for God's existence in creation itself. And this is what we're going to seek to do in the next 2 Sundays. We could go through this over a long period of time, or I could cover it in a snippet. The reason why I decided to do this is because this is the largest audience. I could do it in a Sunday evening where there's just a few of us, or in some other opportunity, but this is where most of us gather, and so I want to take advantage of the fact that you're here to learn this. Now, as we go through this, we're going to be dealing with some science and stuff like that over the next couple of weeks, but primarily all you need to bring with you is common sense, okay? Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician, okay? I took 2 years of biology in university, I took chemistry, and I took geophysics, and that was 30-some years ago, okay? Yet I can understand all of this plainly. And I'm going to say, if I can do it, you can do it. So just sit back, listen, maybe take some notes, but all you need is a healthy dose of common sense. Okay? So let's dive in. Today we're going to look macroscopically at the universe itself. Not the details of the universe, describing what it's like and so forth and so on, but to demonstrate that it is far more probable that God created the universe, thus demonstrating his existence, than that the universe is one, eternal, or two, self-caused. Okay, we're dealing with probability here because no one can prove with mathematical certainty, so that's 100% mathematical certainty, that God exists or that God does not exist. That is a statement that cannot be proven in the mathematical sense of proof. What we're talking about is what William Dembski termed inference to the best explanation. When you look at all the evidence, what is more probable and what is more likely? And what I'm going to suggest is that it is far, 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 far more probable that God exists than he doesn't. In fact, I'm going to argue that those who would deny the existence of God cannot even begin to prove their point. They just come up intellectually bankrupt. They can't make a case, at least not a rational case. Now, that's just throwing out words, right? I haven't made any claims or statements. Many scientists and academics want you to believe that in the famous words of Carl Sagan, maybe some of you are old enough to remember that show Cosmos that he had, and he began every episode with the same phrase. And he said, among other things, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. They want you, that is, these naturalistic evolutionary scientists, to believe that they have, that is science, explained not as a hypothesis, but as a fact, the origin and evolution of the universe apart from a creator, however you want to define that term. So when you turn on TV, you watch a program, a documentary, a TV show, you watch a movie, they always make it seem as though they have it all figured out. Maybe there's the last vestiges of this little detail they're trying to figure out, but 99% of it, it's all figured out. It's a done deal. And they'll have somebody there in a lab coat or somebody with a doctorate or something to give the appearance of authority. They do this, by the way, in commercials, much more so in the U.S. than in Canada. If you go to the U.S., you notice you put on and every other commercial on TV is about a drug, right? Or something like that. And they always have somebody with a white lab coat and a stethoscope around their neck. Because it doesn't matter if that person's an actor or not. Soon as you see the lab coat, the stethoscope, they have authority. They have weight behind them. And unfortunately, that's how we view things externally. We just look, that person has a PhD behind their name. That person is such and such. Therefore, we need to listen to them. Well, maybe not. A lot of people with PhDs speak a lot of rubbish. And unfortunately, in the scientific world, there's a lot of half-truths. And a half-truth is also known as what? A lie. They want you to believe that science is proven such and that you can be absolutely certain of their conclusion. It is only, according to them, the ignorant, the naive, and the religious who refuse to conform to the beliefs of quote-unquote science. By the way, that's science interpreted through their lens. Not science as far as mixing chemicals and doing experimentations, what's called operational science, but it's their interpretation that is considered infallible. Such is the illusion. The fact of the matter is that questions like the origin of the universe are only theoretical, philosophical, and untestable by direct observation. Listen to some non-Christian scientists who do not believe in God, who believe in naturalistic explanations for the origin of the universe. People such as Richard Liu, who is a physicist at the University of Alabama, who says these shocking words: astronomy can never be a hardcore physics discipline because the universe offers no control experiment, i.e., with no independent checks. It is bound to be highly ambiguous and degenerate. Cosmology is not even astrophysics. All the principal assumptions in the field are unverified or unverifiable in the laboratory, and researchers are quite comfortable with inventing unknowns to explain the unknown. That's somebody being honest and saying, listen, cosmology, trying to figure out the origin of the universe, the nature of the universe. You can't do a laboratory experiment on the universe because we only have one. And we can't directly interact with it in the way that they would need to. And so he says it's not even a real science. Now, he's not the only one that said this. Lots and lots and lots. When they have an opportunity to be honest, this gentleman, he goes on to say, when the subject matter is as fundamental as time and space or something more mundane, astronomical observations can never by themselves be used to prove beyond reasonable doubt a physical theory. This is because we live in only one universe. The indispensable control experiment is not available. There's no experimentation. It's all philosophy. It's all worldview. Astronomer James Gunn of Princeton University says, a basic tenet of science is that you can do repeatable experiments. Okay, go back to grade 9 science class. You were told, you know what, you come up with a hypothesis, then you create an experiment in order to test that hypothesis. And if you really want to know if the conclusion is true, you repeat it. If you get the same result every single time, then you know that the conclusion is sound. But you do an experiment. What Gunn is saying, you can't do any experiments on the universe, none. Yet we're led to the conclusion that they've done all the experimentation necessary to come to the conclusions that they arrived at. Now, Gunn's not a lightweight. He's at a prestigious Ivy League school. And that's what he says. You can't do any repeatable experiments. And this is really important to understand. Scientific models, you have to understand this. Scientific models of the origin of the universe are mathematical models. They're models done on computers using sophisticated math. That's what they are. We think they're looking through telescopes and they see certain things and they're able to bridge it all together and put the pieces together. No, it's people using theoretical math based on assumptions, inputting data sets into supercomputers and then pressing a button and voila, out comes their theory. But that's all it is. It's a mathematical theory. It's theoretical by nature. They cannot test it in the real world. You cannot wind back the clock, go back to the beginning to see if your theory is correct. We only live in the present. And their models are based upon philosophical worldview grounds. In fact, theoretical physicist George Ellis. Now, George Ellis is a giant in the field. He was a collaborator with people like Stephen Hawking, whom everybody's heard of. So he's one of the absolute giants in this field. And George Ellis said in an interview for a science magazine, he says in 1995, What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. Do you ever hear that? He's basically saying we bring our baggage, our assumptions, and then we create our models based upon what we believe. Now think about that. You would get a failing grade in science class if that's what you did. You created a scenario and then you designed the experiment to make sure that you were successful in your prediction. You're monkeying with the experiment because your inputs already guarantee your results. He says, again, what I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that. Before that, he said in the article, he says, I can create this universe, I can create this one, all based on the mathematical input I put in. If I put this in, I get this kind of universe. If I put this in, I get this. If I put this in, I get this. But he's saying it's all based on your assumptions. Your philosophical assumptions is how you program the data. So if you already assume certain things, then your conclusions can support what you're trying to prove, and that's not science. Science is supposed to be objective, right? It's supposed to be neutral. But in this case, it's not. And by the way, it can't be. The nature of this type of science, which is not operational science, by the way, because you can't whip up experiments in labs and things like that. It's more historical science. They're trying to figure out through certain things they see in that how may have it begun? What could have arisen, in certain circumstances to bring about the universe? So it's historical science, not operational. It's not of the same kind. Models of the origin and evolution of the universe are mathematical computer simulations based on unprovable assumptions, the unprovable assumptions of their programmers. These models cannot be confirmed by direct experimentation. They can't. When we look at the question of the origin of the universe, the question could at first be considered biased by the use of the word origin. For if the universe were eternal, it would be wrong to speak of its origin. But it will become clear, however, that it is proper to speak of the universe's origin since it cannot be eternal and must have come into existence a finite amount of time ago. Many used to argue, and some still desire to argue, that the universe is eternal. Because if the universe is eternal, then we don't need to invoke a God or a creator or a cause. It's just all that has been and all there ever will be. Now, science can help us answer this question. And one of the things I want to bring in here is a scientific and philosophical argument called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Now, don't worry about the name. What it refers to is the fact of causality. That the universe must have a cause, and then trying to figure out what that cause must be. It's a very, very simple argument. It has two premises and a conclusion. And it's so easy you can remember it. I just have to tell you once, and you should be able to remember it. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's pretty simple. Now we need to prove it. By the way, logically, it's a sound argument. You can only defeat the argument if you can prove the premises are true, but how the argument is formalized is accurate. There's not a flaw or a contradiction or anything in how the argument is framed. From the conclusion of the argument is further argued that the most probable cause of the universe is God. So if it has a cause, then we have to figure out and extrapolate what would that cause look like. Okay, very, very quickly, and I'll let you figure out more of the details yourself. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, some scholars have tried to set up a straw man, because generally it's theists that try to use this argument, right? They believe in God and they're trying to prove it. So what they try to do is pigeonhole us by creating a straw man argument by rephrasing it incorrectly to say, whatever exists must have a cause. And they would say to us, well, you believe that God is eternal, right? So where did God from? What is God's cause? And so they try to throw the argument on us by misrepresenting what the argument is. The argument says whatever begins to exist has a cause. It doesn't say everything that exists, because God is uncaused. He is eternal. God is in a different category. So they're making a category fallacy by equating the two and misrepresenting the argument. This is an argument from the law of cause and effect, the law of causation. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. Intuition, experience, and logic demonstrates that there are no causeless events. Rather, as one source puts it, quote, the law of causality or cause and effect states that every event, change, or effect in the universe is produced by a preceding cause. It is a foundational principle of philosophy, science, and logic, dictating that nothing occurs without a sufficient reason or antecedent, that is something before it, effectively connecting events in a chronological, logical timeline. In other words, if you saw a ball rolling down the aisle, you wouldn't believe, one, that the ball just uncaused came out of nowhere, but you wouldn't think that the ball just of its own free will decided to roll. Something made it roll. Either we didn't see somebody, a little kid crawling under the pews, start rolling the ball down the aisle, or there's a breeze or something, or gravity. We're going to have a cause to it. Balls don't just start rolling by themselves. We know that something needs to act upon it. There's a law in science that says that an object at rest will remain at rest until it's acted upon by an external force. So you know that the force must be the wind, or somebody threw the ball, kicked it, gravity. Something made it move. It didn't make itself move. Why tell you this? Well, long time ago, there used to be a theory called the cosmic egg. They believed that there was this infinitely small, infinitely dense particle called a singularity, and at some point it just rapidly expanded and it formed the universe as we know it. That expansion, and that nowadays they would call that the Big Bang theory. But the idea is they would say that the universe in this infinitesimally small, dense particle existed for all time, and then it began to expand. That's a violation of logic and science, because science says that you must have a cause-effect relationship. If it is at rest, it will eternally be at rest unless it's acted upon by something outside of itself. If there is nothing else outside of itself, it will never expand and become the universe. So that theory went into the rubbish bin. So what we need to begin understand is there are no causeless events. It's irrational to speak of a causeless event. It violates logic and rationality, intuition, and experience. Now, there is a modern example where some are trying to get around this. You have to understand is that they so desperately want to get rid of God as an explanation that they will cling on to anything. So what do? Well, there's a part of physics called quantum mechanics. Quantum just means it's dealing with something really, really, really small, at the subatomic level, smaller than atoms. So in theoretical physics, in the quantum level, okay, this really, really small level, which, by the way, you can't see any of it. It's all based upon what they detect. So what they think they see. So they go from the effect back to what they imagine the cause to be. So in quantum physics, there's something called a quantum fluctuation. And this quantum fluctuation creates what they call virtual particles. Don't worry about the details. You're going to forget anyways. Remember, all we're doing is putting our common sense hats on. In quantum physics, and this is theoretical because some people don't believe that this even exists, but the idea is, you all know Einstein's famous equation, right? E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. So out of a little tiny bit of mass, you can get a massive amount of energy. That's why nuclear explosions are so massive. What Einstein figured in his relativity theory is that the experiment can run in both directions. That is, energy can convert to matter and matter can convert to energy. It can go both ways. So the idea of a quantum fluctuation is that in this thing called a quantum vacuum, which is also known as a quantum field, energy can convert to matter because they're just two forms of the same thing. So the fluctuation is that an amount of energy converts and becomes matter. Now, they call them virtual particles is because this fluctuation one to the other happens so fast that you cannot detect it. You can't see it. In other words, what happens is it goes from energy to matter, back to energy, and it happens at a speed that is undetectable. And in fact, and this is really important for this discussion, the more mass that comes into existence, the more matter that comes into existence, the shorter the amount of time it remains in that state. Okay, so energy converts to something the size of 1. Okay, it converts back at a certain rate. If you go up to 10, it converts way faster than it would at 1. You go up to 100, even faster. In fact, there's actually a mathematical principle where they can calculate this. It's based on what's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which nobody understands. So they argue that these virtual particles, they argue that they actually come from nothing. Nothing. The problem is, what they've done is they've changed the word nothing on you. They're going to say, we can prove, because out of nothing come these virtual particles. Yes, they only last for a finite amount of time, really short, but see, it's uncaused. There is a massive problem with that. Because one of the things is they're telling you is that this all happens in what's called a quantum vacuum. Now, you might think of vacuum like the vacuum of space to mean nothing, but that's actually not true. A vacuum, a quantum field, actually has properties, such as energy. Energy is not nothing, it's something. So they've redefined nothing to mean something. That is a quantum field that has properties to it. So a quantum fluctuation has to occur and can only occur, if it does, if there is a quantum field with energy in it in order to cause this effect. It's not causeless and it's not from nothing. So, again, you don't need to remember any of this other than if you ever hear, and many scholars argue this. Lawrence Krauss is the guy who's out there touting it now. Hawking did it before. But these are big names. You turn on the television, I see Stephen Hawking. He must know what he's talking about, right? Okay. He would be speaking from the grave now because he died a number of years ago. But when he was alive, many people thought Stephen Hawking, he's the smartest man in the world. You got to believe him. He knows what he's talking about, right? No, he doesn't. He's so utterly biased by his conclusion that he doesn't realize that his arguments are nonsense. And I'm going to go on and show this. And it's not because I'm smarter than him. It's because people who are smarter than him have pointed out that his argument is completely fallacious on the scientific level and on the philosophical level. In fact, John Lennox, in his book, God and Einstein, proved that in one statement he makes 3 logical errors in one sentence. So, Even though people will tout that virtual particles, there's an example of a causeless event, it's nonsense. It's not true. They've changed the meaning of the words because it's not something from nothing and it's not uncaused. There's something going on that causes the energy to convert to matter and then back. Okay? So there's something going on. There are scientific laws at work that cause this to happen. So it's not uncaused. People might not know what causes it or what happens behind the scenes, but there are no causeless events, including this one. Let me move on. So the premise number one, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is true. That premise is true. It cannot be disproven. Premise number two, the universe began to exist. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. People used to try to argue that the universe is eternal, and then they got nailed by scientific and logical reasoning all along, and they tried. Okay, there was some guy, Sir Fred Hoyle, and some of his co-workers came up with a theory called the steady state theory, which was eternal. Some have eternal inflationary models, or oscillating universe, where the universe begins, it expands, gets to the end, bounces back, and it just does it over and over and over again. Okay, these have all been proven to be untrue. They don't work. Again, they're mathematical models, but the problem is when they put in the right parameters, as far as they can figure out, they all don't work. In fact, Hoyle, in order to make his eternal universe, had to violate the first law of thermodynamics. And I hope you remember that one. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be rearranged. Matter doesn't just poof come into existence out of nothing. That violates the first law of thermodynamics. Well, what did they have? They were having little hydrogen atoms popping into the universe out of nowhere in order to change the laws to not the conservation of energy, but the conservation of density. As long as the density of the universe remained the same, they argued it could be eternal. But they were arguing for something that was nonsense. Hydrogen just doesn't come into existence out of nothing. That's nonsense. Ex nihilo nihilo fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. You can't just create your own rules. And so that's why it just faded into oblivion, is because people just couldn't swallow that. You're trying to explain one unknown by a bigger unknown. Now, let me start with a philosophical argument here, why it's impossible that the universe could be eternal. Now, when we're talking about the universe being eternal, what it would mean is that from the present, there would be an infinite amount of time before today. If you're going backwards by minutes, hours, weeks, months, years, millennia, whatever, the number of intervals between today and eternity is infinite. That's what they're arguing, okay, in this philosophical argument. Now, let me give you an example. That would be what is known as an actual infinite. In a certain branch of mathematics called set theory, dealing with sets or collections. Okay, it's an advanced theory of mathematics. Infinity is an actual number. Okay, they can't write it down. They use a symbol. So the symbol is the Hebrew letter aleph, and then they use a subscript. So when you make a letter or number smaller and you lower it down, and it's the number 0. So it's called the aleph null or aleph naught or ought. It's a symbol that means infinite. And it's an actual number. You can't write it down because it just goes on and on and on and on. But in this branch of mathematics, there's a symbol for it. Now, let me give you an illustration of what this would look like to show you that in reality, that is the real world, there cannot exist an actual infinite. because it leads to absolute absurdities. And yet these are true in mathematics, not in reality. Let's imagine we have a library. And in the library, there are an infinite number of books. Okay, so aleph, null, books, a set, a number. Okay, from now on, I'm just calling it infinite. So we have an infinite number of books. But in that library, we have an infinite number of blue books and an infinite number of red books. The total is an infinite. But if we use common sense, doesn't it appear that an infinite number of blue books plus an infinite number of red books would give us 2 infinite, right? And 1 plus 1 equals 2. And yet, an infinite number of blue books plus an infinite number of red books equals infinity. It doesn't increase it. Now, lady in red, let's say you go to the library and you decide, I like red. I'm going to check out all the red books from the library. How many red books did she check out from the library? An infinite. How many remain? You have all the blue books there, is an infinite. You see, it leads to absolute nonsense in the real world. How is it that you removed an infinite and yet you still have the same number of books? And yet this is irrefutable. What happens if I input, let's take blue, or purple. Let's go with purple. So we have red, blue, purple. And I put an infinite number of purple books into the library. Now what's the total? Exactly the same. Okay, forget color. What happens if I remove all the odd number books? How many books remain? I still have an infinite because I have all the even books left, and there's an infinite number of even books. What mathematicians and philosophers have discovered is that an actual infinite as a set cannot exist in the real world. There is no such thing. Now let's apply it to us so that it actually is useful today. If the universe was eternal, how many number of intervals of time would be from today to the beginning? By the way, there is no beginning. How many would there be? An infinite. So I begin to walk one step at a time because a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right? So I begin to walk one step at a time. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. I start walking. 1 year goes by, 10 years go by, 1,000,000 years go by. How many steps remain? An infinite. Let's spin it around. If we go to the supposed beginning, which does not exist, and we begin that journey, how many steps until we get to today? Can you ever reach today? You cannot. The universe cannot be eternal in the past as an actual infinite. It cannot. It has to have a beginning. Otherwise, the rational conclusion is today could not have come. It is in the infinite past. You cannot bridge an infinite chasm. It's impossible. Now, I'll let you look into that more, but you're gonna come to the conclusion that there's no way out of that argument. There just isn't. Now, people try to, again, trip Christians up by saying, well, then the same thing happens to God, right? Because God is infinite? Not in the same way. Because we're speaking of time as a series of successive events, and scholars have argued always that God's relationship to time is not the same as ours. It is not. And there's all kinds of different theories, and I don't know which one is right, but all of them negate the problem. Because God is not in time unless he chooses to be in time. One thing you may not understand is that time is a physical property. Did you know that? According to relativity theory, time can be changed by speed or things like gravity. If you were to take a clock, not a digital one, but if you were to take a clock and you were to go at sea level, and then you put a clock that is in exact precision with that one, so you set the two, one is put on the top of Mount Everest, one is put at sea level, they are going to tick at different rates. And it has nothing to do with the clock. It has to do with relativity theory. Gravity affects the flow of time. That's why if you were in a black hole, time would be completely different. Time would stand still. Einstein argued that if you were traveling at the speed of light, time would stand still for you, but it would be going at an infinite rate at other parts in the universe. Time is part of the fabric of space. It's a thing. So, if there is no thing, no time, matter, space, energy, time as a series of successive events like we know it does not exist. So, in their concept of time, you cannot ask the question, what was before, because there is no time before the so-called Big Bang theory. It doesn't exist. Okay, that's for a different time. Okay, some scientific arguments for the fact that the universe cannot be eternal. Well, first of all, the second law of thermodynamics. In science, in the universe, all that, everything is winding down. There's only a certain amount of usable energy in the universe. It only flows in one direction. Okay, so there can't be a perpetual motion machine or things like that. It's impossible. It violates this law. Because the law says, basically how energy works, and we're talking about thermal energy here, heat, is two things acting upon itself. If you were to get a hot cup of coffee and drop an ice cube into it, over enough time it comes to thermal equilibrium, and that is everything in that cup is the same temperature. We just call it room temperature. Now, what happens is it always flows from hot to cold. So actually, it's not the ice cube that is cooling down the hot. It's the hot transferring energy to the cold. So it's actually the hot is melting the ice. Why do I tell you this? Because it only goes in one direction. It can't go the other direction. So in the universe, think of a gas tank. There's only so much energy. Once the fuel is used up, there's no more fuel to be used to do work. Now, I've got to use my little snowblower a lot this year. And if I use it long enough, it runs out of gas and then it stops. And it stops until I go and put more gasoline in the engine. The universe is what's called a closed system. It means nobody is putting gas in the tank. And so as atoms and the interactions in the universe that are all the energy properties of the universe, what we call kinetic energy, once that's all used up, there's none left. And scientists, it doesn't matter whether they're Christians or non-Christians, they believe in God, they don't. They all talk about the cold death of the universe. That is, at some point, the universe will become at absolute zero, and there will be no motion in the universe, even on the atomic level. There's nothing. Everything comes to a stop when it runs out of energy. So the second law of thermodynamics would tell us that if the universe was eternal in the distant past, whatever point, remember we're talking about an infinite, so we can't pick a time, the universe would have run out of energy and ceased to do work. There's no heat, no light, no motion, no nothing. But as cold as it is outside, there's still heat. There's still motion. There's still light. So the universe cannot be eternal because it's still using up energy. In fact, it's estimated that our sun will continue to burn, unless something would happen to it, for another 5 billion years. That's how much energy there is in it. So if the universe was eternal, it would have run out of energy in the past, but it hasn't. And so people tried to get around this, but they can't. Many years ago at Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday party, they had this at Cambridge University, and they brought in the top cosmologists in the world. And one of the presentations there was a bunch of research by some of the leading cosmologists in the world, headed by a man named Alexander Vilenkin. And Alexander Vilenkin gave a horrible birthday present to Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking didn't want to believe in God. He wanted to believe in a universe from nothing. And Vilenkin came in and they popped the balloon. Because they and his team had done all kinds of mathematical experiments on all the various theories for the origin of the universe. And they came to this conclusion that even today has not been proven wrong. This is what Vilenkin said. And this is not what he wanted the results to be. He said that all mathematical models cannot possibly be eternal in the past. There must be some kind of boundary. In other words, when they look at the universe and they try to wind it back, they always come to a starting point. And that makes them angry. They don't want that. But they looked at all the models, all of them, and they said, uh-oh, they all have the same problem. They have a boundary, a starting point. He went on and said this, all the evidence we have says the universe had a beginning. Philosophy says the universe had a beginning. The second law of thermodynamics says it had a beginning. Even the first law says it has a beginning because the universe can't pop into existence of its own accord. And Vilenkin said, every single model. In fact, he went on to say, and you can go and watch the lecture online if you want. He went on to say that there are no mathematical proposals that can get around it. In other words, there aren't even hypothetical ones. So, how do we get around this? Because we know they're not going to give up. We know they're not going to just say, well, God must exist then. Well, then you have things like this. In Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he says, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, think of that. Smartest man in the world, right? Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now that statement, John Lennox thinks that there's 3 contradictions in that statement. 3 fallacies in that one statement. And he says, I'm not sure if in any literature, anywhere in the world, somebody has made 3 errors like that in one sentence. Anyways, in this context, what he's arguing for is, he argues that if you were to measure the total amount of energy in the universe, he says that that total comes to 0. Now, you have to understand there's different kinds of energy. There's negative and positive. So if you take the negative plus the positive, it equals 0. And it has to be perfectly balanced at 0. So he argues that if it's 0, then we can get a universe from nothing. Now, there are massive problems with this. Negative and positive energy, are they nothing or are they something? They're something. So right off the bat, he's changed the definition of nothing because he's saying something that is negative energy and something that is positive energy balance out at 0. That's not nothing. And yet, according to the mathematical models, when they talk about a universe coming from nothing, what they mean is non-being, nothing, the absence of everything. There is no time, space, matter, energy. There is nothing. Nothing is the absence of absolutely everything. There is nothing, non-being. He just changed the meaning of the word and didn't tell you. Because out of nothing for him means out of energy that exists. And he talks about because there's a law like gravity. Okay? Laws don't do anything. They are descriptions only. Now, he's not the only one that's argued for this. You probably know some of the names if I mention them. People like Isaac Asimov, Paul Davies, Lawrence Krauss. Okay, they're trying to use terms and they're changing the meaning, but they don't tell you. So it makes it sound impressive. Now, nothing by definition has no properties. Nothing doesn't have length, weight, breadth, color, nothing. J.P. Moreland says this. He says, nothingness is not an entity which has an equal amount of positive and negative properties which comprise the stuff for the production of a specific state of affairs. Nothingness has no properties whatever. He continues speaking about the irrationality of views like Isaac Asimov, Paul Davies. Okay, these are physicists. Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, others. He says, quote, such talk seems to say that non-being, that is nothingness, is identical to an existent state of affairs with positive and negative properties. But nothingness is just that. And nothingness has no nature, no causal powers or tendencies towards anything whatever. You can't say nothing made the universe. Nothing is nothing. Okay? Even the Sound of Music got that right. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. Furthermore, as John Lennox notes, and he has 3 doctorates, he's a professor emeritus at Oxford University. He has 2 doctorates in mathematics and 1 in philosophy. If anybody has the label genius, it would be attached to him. He is an evangelical Christian, by the way, so it shows that science and faith can go together nicely. Lennox has pointed out that Hawkins is absolutely wrong in crediting a scientific law with properties. Lennox says scientific laws are not physical entities, but abstract, immaterial concepts that arise out of observing the physical nature. Okay, so the law of gravity describes how gravity works, but it's not gravity and it doesn't do anything. It's a description of how gravity works. The law of gravity does not exist if gravity doesn't exist. That's the point where he's refuting Hawking. Hawking is saying because there's a law like gravity, well, the law is meaningless. It's an abstraction if there isn't gravity. But if it's nothing, there is no gravity. So who cares if there's a law? The law has nothing to act upon because there is no gravity. He says, scientific laws are not physical entities, but abstract, immaterial concepts that arise out of observing the physical universe. The laws are not independent of the universe. We cannot talk about a law of nature if there's no nature that they describe. So this argument, okay, from causality, that the universe must have a cause. Okay, now a lot of scholars, Christians, they want to cling on to the Big Bang model. Okay, you all know what the Big Bang model is. Sometime in the infinite past, they would argue about 13.7 billion years ago. Poof, out of nothing, the universe began to expand, and over time it expanded, it cooled, and it coalesced into us. Okay, I believe it's absolute rubbish. I don't think that there's any serious science or common sense behind it, especially because I believe the Bible. But you don't need to argue for the Big Bang to make this work. In fact, the Big Bang could be thrown in the rubbish trash where it belongs, and this argument still works perfectly fine. Because the universe needs a beginning. That's all we need to argue. The universe is not eternal. It had to come into existence from nothing, and something must have brought it into existence. By the way, you'll hear about multiverses and that. Vilenkin and them showed the same problem with all of them. There is no model that works. None. You can't have infinite inflation of universes, bubble universes popping into existence all the way. That can never be proven. But he says even if those were true, they all have the same problem too. You need something to hang the beginning on. Because you can't have an infinite regress of effects. Something needs to be the cause, what they call the ultimate or first cause. So the universe, because of the law of cause and effect, and because the universe cannot be eternal, had to have a cause. So what's the cause like? Well, William Lane Craig has done a great job of philosophically and scientifically figuring this out for us. I'm not going to quote him directly, but what he points to is the fact that because time as we know it doesn't exist, the being must be timeless. He can't be eternal in a time sense because then he has the same problem of successive events. God must somehow be outside of time, transcend time. So God relates to time in a different category. So what we see here is that it must be a transcendent being. He can't be part of the universe. He must be eternal, having no cause. He cannot be self-caused because that's a contradiction. God is not self-caused. He didn't bring himself into existence. He would have to exist in order to do that. God is uncaused, eternal. So it must be transcendent. It can't be part of the universe. He must be immaterial as well, because material is the properties of the universe. So God must be immaterial. So John 4 says God is spirit. He's immaterial. Okay? He also must be intelligent. It must be a mind. Because the only type of agency, so causation, that could bring something like the universe into effect is, the only thing in the universe that they know of is intelligence. So he must be an infinite mind. But because the universe began a finite time ago, it must be a free agent. In other words, the agent decided to bring the universe into existence. And there are rational philosophical reasons for this. If it were not rational, then the universe would begin at the same time as the cause. There would be a slight difference, but what William Craig uses the idea, if the universe had water and the universe was eternally cold, below zero, there wouldn't be a time when the water froze. The water would be frozen from eternity. So there has to be a starting point where the agent decided to bring the universe into existence. And what scholars say is we call that agent God, has the properties of God, eternality. It must be greater than the effect. Okay, one of the laws of causation is that the effect or the cause must be equal to or greater than the effect. So God has to be greater than the universe. The cause must be greater than the universe. So before the universe, he can't be contingent. Otherwise, you need to find a cause for God or the creator. He must be all-powerful in order to bring about this. And then other things like fine-tuning arguments show that he must be infinite in intelligence to organize things the way they are and the precision that they are. And he must be personal because it has to be a volition that decides to bring it into existence. And for more details on that, William Lane Craig, his book, Reasonable Faith, he's got a long section dealing specifically with that. And he moves from one argument to the other, showing that it's the only logical conclusion. So for you, this might be completely irrelevant, all that we've talked about today. But it shouldn't be. We all know people that struggle with things like this. I've told you this story before, but I had a relative years ago who he claimed to be an atheist. And he believed in the Big Bang Theory. And I was in high school at the time. And my dad had an opportunity to try to, take him on in a friendly way. My dad was trying to evangelize him and break down this barrier. I didn't know anything at the time. Zero. I wish I knew now what I knew, or knew then what I know now. It might not have made any difference to him. He may not have been looking for a rational argument. Maybe he was looking just for an argument. But I wish I could have shown him the fact that what people are taught by the mainstream medium, what they're taught in public school, what they're taught, and so forth and so on, it actually isn't science. It's all philosophy, and it's bad philosophy. What one person called, who is an atheist, said it's religion. You've all heard of the new atheism. That's Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett. These people, they're supposedly the ones arguing that religion's bad and God is awful and you need to be an atheist. These people are touting a religion. It's not science. And people need to know that. Can you believe in God? Should you? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make a cumulative argument. This one may not have persuaded you in the least, and it may not persuade people in the least. But what it does, it's part of the argumentation that shows the probability of one being greater than the other. Because in this argument, okay, you have to define what the cause is of the universe. But what we've proven is that the standard answer that the universe came from nothing or the universe is eternal is fallacious. It's wrong. And therefore, at this point at least, we have the better argument. Much, much better argument.